Hi, everybody. You want to make the second part of the video on the Holocaust, and excuse me. Welcome to this lecture. This might be the last lecture we do for this semester. I'm debating if I'm going to record a couple more lectures for next week or not, and I'm leaning probably not to. Want you guys to work on your paper and other things for class. So we'll see. Anyways, maybe. So we can just check modules and announcements. I'll let you guys know if I record more things. Let's pick up where we left off. And since the last video recorded last week, I've continued to do quite a bit of research, and I found so much stuff. I probably want to do two or three more videos on this topic. It's important, but we're not going to. We're going to do this one. So let's return right into it. So get comfortable. Welcome back, and let's get back in this incredibly important topic. Also, I'm going to let you guys know one of the dangers when you talk about a topic like the Holocaust or the Holodomor or the Armenian genocide or the Cambodian killing fields, etc., Stalin's purges, etc., is to get intellectually excited about analyzing such a profound and horrific subject and looking into causes, consequences, the nuances, the complexities of it, the views of different scholars of the topic, all of which is very important as a historian to do those things. Simultaneously, we can never forget that for all these mass numbers, there are individuals, peoples, mothers, fathers, husbands, wives, grandkids, kids, parents, whose lives are tragically extinguished. And the profound loss, that's ongoing loss. And I want to tell, at the end of this lecture, a personal encounter I had with this very specific topic, the Holocaust, that I had a few years back when I was in Washington, D.C. So, and in this lecture, I want to give you an example of a kind of personalized version of this topic, something I experienced. So we'll get to that at the end of the lecture. So. All right, so let's pick up where we left off. So, as you guys know, in the early 30s, specifically 1933, Hitler comes to power in Germany. Now, prior to this, certainly through Hitler's anti-Semitic rhetoric, blaming the Jews, that his fascination, obsession with the Jews, among other things too, it's not just the Jews, you guys know, communists, Liberal Democrats, and the stab in the back and all that. But what makes the difference between his ascension to power is, for the first time now, the Nazis are in a position of power, of having state control, and can use the German state now for the first time to go after the Jewish population in Germany. Now, already, certainly, the brown shirts and others in Hitler's command or within the Nazi Party's apparatus have already targeted Jews to some extent. But they did not have the power of the state behind them. So you might have people being beaten up, assaulted, stores being broken into, people being threatened, occasional murders, those things taking place. Yes, that's with the essay. But what's different now is in 33 is now Hitler's in power. And so Hitler's availability, utilizing the apparatus of state to go after the Jewish population, has now exponentially grown. But, and this is important, but Germany still is, again, it's getting kind of complicated, but still to some degree a nation of laws. So the Holocaust does not start in Germany when Hitler comes into power in 1933. Now, certainly escalating dark things happen to the Jewish population, as we'll get to here in a minute. But the large-scale mass execution, extinguishing of the Jewish population, which we refer to as the Holocaust, that does not begin until really World War II. Now, absolutely many precursor steps are taken in a direction that makes sense and maybe is a logical conclusion in the final solution, the Holocaust. But that actually does not take place until the advent of World War II. So, for example, the number of Jews killed in Nazi Germany prior to World War II is a relatively small number. Now, many Jews are definitely and justifiably very afraid. They're excluded from all kinds of professions. individual Jews are killed. Some of the Jews are rounded up and sent to camps. Some are assassinated or murdered, but not on a large scale. An example of this, I was listening to a lecture this morning about Kristallnacht, which we'll get to here in just a minute. But in that night, the number of Jews estimated killed in Kristallnacht in Germany is around 200. Now, still, that's horrific. But it's not the kind of numbers we kind of typically imagine with the Holocaust, because, again, the Holocaust does not begin until actually World War II. Although, again, a whole series of systematic, sinister, maybe dehumanizing, making Jews stateless, beyond the protection of law, those things are all happening bit by bit, and sometimes in dramatic jumps in Nazi Germany, but the Holocaust as we know it does not begin until World War II. Okay. There was various plans of how, by the way, what the Nazis progressively doing is trying to think of ways to limit Jews' access to German life. And we'll come back to that in just a minute, but there's a whole variety of, can we pass laws that eliminate their access, the professions, where they can be, what they can do, how we can visually identify them, a whole series of those. And then with some kind of long distance plan of, is there a way we can get rid of them entirely out of Germany? And it appears from all the scholarship I've seen that Hitler and the Nazis not necessarily have like one master plan of how to do that. Now, certainly wanted the Jews out of Germany and eventually what we see as a German empire they plan to create. But how exactly that happened, I think, was not so clear to them. For example, Jews that had money, many of them were able to leave Germany. Now, some were unable to, but some of them were able to leave Germany. Now, the difficulty of leaving Germany is usually, and there's exceptions to this, usually not so much leaving Germany per se prior to the start of the war. The more difficulty is you have to have a visa to go someplace. And can you get another European or America or South American country, et cetera, or wherever, can you get them to grant you a visa to immigrate there? And that is very difficult. That's a whole separate topic. I wanted to even go on, have a whole digression into that topic, but I think for time I'm not going to. But the culpability of the United States and Western Europe and many of the nations that when things are going increasingly dark in Nazi Germany, prior to the war, we're talking mid-30s, late 30s, that most nations in the world were a slam door in the face of Jewish refugees trying to flee. So many of the German Jews within Germany had the option to leave, at least theoretically, but where you could go, you have to have an entrance visa to go somewhere. And for the vast majority of them, that's a slam door in their face that the United States or France, England, etc., over and over again, these countries saying we don't want any more Jews, and that is no. But the Nazis had initially thought, well, maybe if we make conditions hard enough, they simply flee out of Germany, problem solved, there's no more here. Now, later on, maybe that wouldn't work, or other nations won't take them. Some Nazi officials like Himmler and Reinhold Heydrich, we'll talk about a little bit later, thought, well, maybe we could, especially after they conquered France during the war itself, there's what was called the Madagascar Plan, which is maybe we can use the island off the coast, large island off the coast of Africa, Madagascar, and we could use those as a destination to send all Jews in Europe there in exile, with the idea of many of them, at least physically, they're long gone, and many of them would not survive there in the hot, harsh climate there in Madagascar, problem solved. Then the idea shifted during the war itself, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself because I'm not quite there with the timeline of the lecture. I'm just giving you a little preview of Germany having these kind of contingencies plans. But then began to think of the war of Russia. The next German plan was, well, maybe we can send the Jews into Siberia. Basically, we can employ Stalin's Gulag, once we conquer Russia, of course. We can utilize Stalin's Gulag for Jews who want to get rid of it, just like the way Stalin sidelined and in some cases intentionally got rid of many Russian dissidents of all kinds during the purges in the Gulag, that the Germans could use the Gulag for the Jews. And the Jews could be worked to get some value, and of course many would die in the harsh conditions, but that's all good too, and they'll work itself out, and the Jews will be in the far reaches of the Gulag in the former Soviet Union. Now eventually that's going to fall apart too, and that's when you get to the final solution that we're so familiar with the Holocaust, which is the gas chambers. Now again, that's all jumping ahead because we're not there yet chronologically, but I just want to give you a brief preview of escalating measures inside Nazi Germany prior to the war. But the Holocaust and what to do with the Jews, that still is that was still up in the air as the Nazis are kind of navigating what comes next at that time. All right. Now, how the Nazis view the Jews. So this is a big topic. We're going to try and make it short and pretty straightforward. Essentially, the Nazi view of the Jews as a profound racial / I put maybe slashing better, spiritual threat to Germany. And they'd argue to the world. Now, they're not particularly concerned with the world. They're concerned with Germany or eventually the German Empire, which they plan to create. But they would argue that the Jews are a different kind of species of humanity, that they contribute nothing positive, they're almost like a leech or bloodsucker on humanity, and that is racially who they are. We talked about this in the last lecture, right? That Judaism is it's not really a thought system, although it can come out in thought system, but it's really a racial core identity. Now, because that racial core identity, certain thought systems will come out of them. For example, like Christianity or communism, all of which distract or weaken or destroy the mindset of Hitler and the Nazis' dog-eat-dog world of social Darwinism, where races are competing for dominance, and the Christian ideals of equality of all mankind, the brotherhood of all mankind, that is garbage because that's distracting from the reality of this dog-eat-dog racial struggle. So that's not going to work. Communism also positing the idea that people should all be equal and all races around the world are equal and so forth. Into colonialism. Of course, again, the Nazi hierarchy, it's a free-for-all in this combat zone between species and races. And of course, the one that matters and the best is the German race. Frankly, kind of the hell with the rest of the races. The last thing we want to do is have any kind of version of ideological, spiritual equality. Added to that, specifically, as you guys know, specifically in the Nazi playbook is the idea of the stab in the back. That the Germans in World War I did not really lose the war. That in fact, that not just the Jews, but the Jews and the communists and the socialists, but the Jews stabbed the German soldier in the back, and that's why we lost. You see that cartoon there on the left. You can see where the Star of David on that hat. And they'd say whether the Jews were in the form of bankers or socialists or communists or liberal Democrats, but the Jews are the ones who have their hands all over our stab in the back. Additionally, oftentimes when the Nazis looked at communism, in their eyes, they'd see this right here. Let me highlight this for you guys. Actually, this whole thing should be highlighted for you guys. There we go. They would see, when they see a communist, in their mind, almost immediately it jumps to Jewish Bolshevism. Even though those two things are not synonymous, the same, but in the eyes of many Nazis, that's how they looked at it. They viewed communism as an outgrowth of Jewish racial negative thought or destructive thought that comes out of the Jewish race. That's how they perceive communism. And you can see in this case, now this was not done in Nazi Germany, actually it was done by a white Russian propagandist during the Russian Civil War. But that anti-Semitism, of course, not limited just to Germany. You see that, and also many white Russians. But you see a depiction, a caricature of Trotsky, and Trotsky, all his blood oozing down from his monstrous feet and hands, and you see this pile of corpses and skulls. And if you look carefully, you see he's wearing a necklace that has a Star of David, saying that this bloody version of Bolshevism is Jewish Bolshevism. So in the Nazis' hands, they see this as communism as being just one more front in the way the Jews racially, cancerously project themselves, and communism is just its latest iteration of how Jews are a threat to all humanity, in this case ideologically, in this case through communism. And finally, they say things that Jews want this war, that the outbreak of war will be the Jews' chance to triumph. Kind of back, we talked about last lecture, the protocols learned in Elder Zion, that somehow the Jews are using all the manipulating behind the scenes, these world events, and that it will lead to a Jewish takeover of the world. all that is pulled into the Nazis' view of the Jews. So now, if you bought into this stuff, you can see why the Nazis feel indignation and morally good that they are cleansing Germany above all, but they do the world a favor too, of the Jewish racial spiritual menace that is driving the world and badly damaging the world. It has historically and is now currently in the modern world doing great damage, and we're going to bring that to an end. There's some more examples of that. You see that cartoon on the left. It's called the Eternal Jew Exhibit that came out in 1937 in Germany, and you can see under that Jew's arm, you can see the sickle and hammer of the Soviet Union or Jewish Bolshevism. Same thing for that poster there in the middle. Another anti-Soviet poster. It's kind of hard to see there, but that's a Russian soldier with all these banded civilians on there. And you look at Notice's cap, he has the red star, and that's a combination of Judaism and Bolshevism together. And as oftentimes is the case, when you have these terrible characters and stereotypes, usually in the stereotype there is examples of or individuals or small groups doing the very thing that is a caricature. So were there some Jews that were communists in Russia? Yes, there were. Trotsky's an example of that. He's not the only one. Were there some Jews in the NKVD that was executing people in Poland or Eastern Europe or Ukraine? Yes, there was. Was the NKVD a Jewish organization? No, it's not. So maybe you have Ukrainian citizens just heartbroken that their father or their husband or their dad was taken away by the NKVD, as in case, as you guys know, in Ukraine, and many of them were killed. Could some of those NKVD officers have been locals who were also happened to be Jews? Yeah, some of them. Of course, many of them are not Jews. But in the Nazi perception, the answer is Jewish organization. That in front of you, the images of the German newspaper Der Stürmer, which warned of a Jewish program to take over the world, saying, who is the enemy? Of course, Jews, the ones who wanted this war. Well, we want peace. It's Jews bringing on this terrible war, these terrible conflicts. Just know that that paper is not officially part of Nazi propaganda, but it was tied to the Nazis, close to the Nazis, even though it was not the official mouthpiece of the Nazi party, but it's aligned with Nazi thought. So now Hitler's in power. In 1937, the Reichstag burns down. A young man is blamed for that. And the importance of that, by the way, he said to be a communist, which probably he probably was, or socialist. The importance of that is following this government building very dramatically being burned in downtown Berlin. Hitler uses that natural worry and crisis and anger over the Reichstag being burned or sabotaged as an excuse to seize absolute power and autocratic power. Now, why is that important? It allows him to have now tremendous power with very few checks and balances left now in Germany, for him to have nearly autocratic power to go after any perceived enemy of Germany or the Nazi party. So while this is directed above all initially at communists and socialists and other ideological enemies, obviously clearly this kind of absolute dictatorial power means the Jews are very vulnerable now in Germany because, for example, the courts, independent police system, most of those now are controlled by the Nazi government. The SS, the Nazi security forces, now can pretty much do as they wish. So the appeal to a German court against an SS arrest or Gestapo arrest, I wish you good luck, because now Hitler is dominating all those aspects of government following the Enabling Act of 1933. And I want to move quickly here because we got quite a bit to go here, but the Nuremberg Laws is just another expression now that the Nazis are firmly in autocratic power. It was passed the Reichstag in September 1935. It's a very specific targeted anti-Semitic code that drives the Jewish community out from mainstream German life into the shadows. So a whole series of occupations they can no longer do, things they can no longer do. Excuse me. it's a very strong statement of where Germany is going to, in this case, eliminate Jews from the public life of Germany. Now, they don't initially, again, this is not, in a sense, the beginning of the killing in a large scale. It has not happened, but is absolutely the stripping away of any kind of civil equality that Jews may have enjoyed prior to this? And the answer is yes. That they're specifically in a targeted minority population whose world now just got very small legally, which makes them obviously exceptionally vulnerable for more actions to come. The Nuremberg laws, I won't go through all these, but all kinds of things, forbidden marriages between Jews and Germans, and a whole series of things similar to that, and the punishment for those things. I mentioned Kristallnacht already, so I'll do this briefly. But Kristallnacht, that'd be November 9 to 10, 1938. This follows a young Jewish Poland young man, Herschel Crispin, don't quote me on pronouncing his last name, who went to the German embassy in London and assassinated a German embassy official in response to the treatment of his family under the Nazis. I think his parents had gone to Germany as Poles for working. His parents are Jews. I think they'd gone there for work. And what had happened to his parents? I think they had not been killed, but they had been impoverished, treated very badly, etc. And they see worse coming, as you guys know. So the young Herschel decides he's going to enact vengeance, and he marches into the Paris German embassy and kills an embassy official. That sparks tremendous anger in Germany, and that unleashes a night of widespread violence against Jews, certainly symbolically, but also physically too, in which many German synagogues are burned that night. A lot of intimidation, arson, beating up, intimidation, and Jews being killed, and others being sent to concentration camps. Now, it's important to mention, I'll just briefly, the concentration camps in Germany, for example, Auschwitz is not yet a death camp. Actually, Auschwitz would not be a good death camp until much later in World War II. It will become a death camp. But concentration camp is a place where the law no longer protects you. You're basically held incommunicado. The courts, for the most part, also have no access to you. It's basically you're in the control of the SS until the SS decides to have you eliminated, or perhaps if they decide to release you at some point. But you're basically beyond the rule of law. And so Jews sit there. Of course, some are going to die there, be executed. Some are killed outright. But at this time, it would be primarily Jewish leadership. The average Jew is not sent there. And there are some Jews that perhaps had at least a slim chance of getting out because it is not yet the death camp. It is certainly a prison camp of extremely harsh conditions. And it's a prison camp that in many ways is beyond the rule of law because now it's under the power. It's run by the SS under Himmler. But again, that's not officially part of the Holocaust yet, although absolutely these are chapters that are going to lead to the Holocaust. Those photographs show examples of Jews being paraded through the streets, being humiliated, beaten, and attacked. And that takes us to this gentleman right here who I want you to know. Let me highlight his name. Raphael Lemkin. Lemkin is the man who's coined the term genocide, which has become sadly all too well known in the second half of the 20th century and in the 21st century. So, of course, it's not that in reality the concept didn't exist, but there have been no word to really define an intentional targeted killing of a specific group. So historically, it doesn't mean it never happened because the term had not been coined, but it's recognizing a reality that existed. Raphael Lemkin was a Polish lawyer, and there's much more to the story. I want to give you guys a short version because of time. But essentially, responding to the Armenian genocide, and they say specifically, and it's a fascinating case I recommend to you guys, but one of the Ottoman Turkish leaders, Talat Pasha, who is most responsible for the Armenian genocide after World War I, fled Turkey and was hiding in Germany, and an Armenian activist, patriot, tracked down Talat Pasha and assassinated him to bring justice to the many hundred thousands of Armenians who were killed in the Armenian genocide. And Raphael Lemkin listened with great interest in the trial of this young assassin who killed Talat Pasha, and his explanation of why he did it, which is to avenge his own family, his mother, who had been killed in the Armenian genocide. And Raphael Lemkin, looking at what had happened in the Ottoman Turkish Empire during World War I, and what we today know as the Armenian genocide, realizes that there has to be a legal definition for this horrific event. We have to put a name to it to alert humanity that this is what this is, to be on the lookout for it, concerned about it, and perhaps even prosecute it. And the word genocide is coined by Lemkin in response to Armenian genocide. And of course, that is exactly what's going to happen with the Jewish community and others in World War II, as you guys know. For some reason, my phone started ringing. Okay. All right. So defining genocide. It would not be till 1948 the United Nations actually defines it. But let's take a minute to look at that because it's important. So let me highlight it for you guys. Here we go. United Nations Convention defined genocide as any of 5 acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. These 5 acts were killing members of the group, causing them serious bodily or mental harm, imposing living conditions intended to destroy the group, preventing births, and forcibly transferring children out of the group. Victims are targeted because of their real or perceived membership of a group and not randomly. Again, it's usually always a group, right? Some group that the majority or the dominant force decides to eliminate. Eliminate or catastrophically damage. Again, by eliminating births, taking their children, or putting in living conditions that are so horrific that death can be the only logical conclusion. And the intent really is to destroy. So that takes us on to really what is going to be the beginning of the Holocaust, and that is when World War II finally arrives. Now, as you know, the Nazis had what I'd say genocidal ideological practices and conceptions, but they had not enacted those to date. I again say that the hatred is so intense, the generalized calls, the dehumanizing Jews. It can be no surprise when the Holocaust actually happened, or the killings. It stems from, well, centuries, maybe millennia of anti-Semitism, combined with the unique conditions and contributions, I said in a negative way, of the Nazi Party in Germany. But it's really going to be in World War II where mass killings begin to happen. That is going to be in Germany's invasion of the East, specifically Poland initially. Now, I divided this lecture up, as you guys know from the last lecture, into 5 parts. Now we're getting into the 4th part, which is the earlier part of the Holocaust from the beginning of World War II. That'd be September 1939. That's the German invasion of Poland, up until December 1941. And that is when we get to the Wannsee Conference, which we'll get to here shortly, and where Germany shifts gears from mass shootings, mass executions, typically again by shooting, and begins to move into the systematic killing machine of the death camps, which will take place after December 1941. But the early portion of the Holocaust is going to be in the East, and this is with mass shootings, both mass and small. Those behind it, of course, Hitler ultimately had responsibility for this, but also Heinrich Himmler, head of SS, and Himmler is right here, and Reinhard Heydrich, which is right here, is his right-hand man, who's in charge of these SS death units, the Eisengruppen, who move into Poland initially, and then later on with the invasion of Russia into Russia and Russian republics, where the Holocaust really kicks off. Now, as you guys know, the Germans plan to take over large portions of Eastern Europe and to use it as a place of colonization for Germans. So that means pushing out the locals. So it's not just the Jews, the Poles themselves. So at the start of World War II, when the Wehrmacht, the German army, moves into Poland, special death units move behind them, which we today know as the Eisengruppen. And the Eisengruppen, their job is to find and eliminate leading Polish leaders, intellectuals, thinkers, any kind of Polish person who would have any kind of serious leadership influence is rounded up by the Eisengruppen and executed, as well as gypsies, anyone who is seen to be in the Communist Party. they get their hands on, and in those early days, Jewish men they got their hands on. In those very early shootings, usually Jewish women and children in those early days typically were not in those early days gunned down, although shortly afterwards they would be. But in the very first killings there in Poland, it typically was Jewish males, along with the groups I mentioned before, any kind of Polish intellectual, Polish leader, or anyone who has ties to the Communist Party are simply taken out and shot in large numbers, as you see depicted there on the right in Poland. Once you guys know the Eisengruppen, that's the group who is most responsible for this. This is the SS organization reporting directly to Reinhard Heydrich, who I want you to know on the right there. I mentioned him already in the previous lecture a while back on Nazi Germany. And obviously he's operating under the head of SS, Heinrich Himmler. So Himmler ultimately, beneath Hitler of course, is enacting this early portion of what today we know as the Holocaust. Now, it's not simply these Eisengruppen death units that their specific job is to execute or to kill. Oftentimes, the Eisengruppen works hand in hand with locals, local Ukrainians, local Poles, local police forces, Wehrmacht or German army units in the area, sometimes SS battle formations also in the area. So it's not just the Eisengruppen. The Eisengruppen, in fact, as far as sheer numbers, are not that large. There's about a total about 3,000 Eisengruppen operating in the East or in Russia. It's not a particularly large number, so they obviously need a considerable amount of help from all those other groups I just mentioned. But the Eisengruppen are the core and the core driving force under orders, of course, to go in these communities, round up undesirables, again, communist or any kind of ethnic or national leader from the area, and of course, obviously, Roma too, the Roma or Gypsies, and Jews. They're best known as you mentioned, the following the Wehrmacht or German army into these conquered territories and working as mobile killing squads. They're often the ones who are actually pulling the trigger. Although again, not always. Sometimes other local groups are pulling the trigger too. In fact, I was listening to a lecture last night by Daniel Mendelsohn. I mentioned his book, The Lost, which I highly recommend to you guys. Listening to him being interviewed last night, and he was saying his old Jewish grandparents responding on accomplices and other national accomplices to the Eisengruppen would say things like this: the Germans are bad, the Poles are worse, and the Ukrainians were the worst. What they mean by that is, in some of these areas, it did not take a lot of work by the Eisengruppen to get the locals to participate in the killings, rounding up Jews, beating some to death, actually participating in other forms of killing, or at the very least, bringing the Jews to the place of execution where the Eisengruppen would shoot them in these mass shootings. But the locals oftentimes were vastly enthusiastic and participated actively. In fact, sometimes some Germans say we didn't have to even do a whole lot. We say we want to do it. And the locals jump to it, and they're quickly to kill the Jews themselves. We don't even have to do a whole lot. Now, obviously, that varies from place to place. There's some scenes of terrible scenes of Eisengruppen. It could be Soviet prisoners of war too, but Soviet citizens. And below you have some horrific photos from those early days. This would be in the German invasion of the northern Baltic states and Ukraine. And I showed that photograph to you guys when we were talking about Ukraine a while back, but showing a Jewish woman, that'd be in Lviv, in German-occupied Poland, now it's in Ukraine, of course, who has been assaulted. And you can see there's a young man holding a stick or club, another young man near her, chasing her. She's already been partially stripped. She's bleeding from the mouth, and they're chasing her through the streets. On the right, in the middle there, you can see a man, again, a local. You see he's wearing a suit. So this probably would be, these would be locals, not a Wehrmacht, but this would be someone local in this case who just kicked that Jewish person in the back and kicked him to the ground. On the right, this is a particularly heinous, brutal crime in where a number of Jews, some of them were accused of being previously in the NKVD, and perhaps some of them could have been, I don't know the details of that, but certainly that Jewish Bolshevism, the threat of that, and the Red Army, and above all, the NKVD massacres in Eastern Europe prior to the arrival of the Wehrmacht or the German army leads a lot of anger from these communities. And that man there holding that iron bar, steel bar, brutally, savagely beat to death a bunch of Jewish men in he was in a garage area and a large crowd of local citizens and German military who came and watched it, but he's the one who was doing the savage, brutal beating to death with that metal bar, and he's a local. So he's not like in the Eisen group at that moment. He's a local who has scores to settle, perhaps a whole variety of reasons why he did that, but a very bestial, death dealer, a quotation, and I'll show you a photograph later on of what he did. This map right here shows the route of the Eisengruppen. There's 4 separate, oops, that's too far. 4 separate major groups, Eisengruppen. That'd be A up here, B, C, and D. So D is in the southern Ukraine into Crimea. D would be in central and northern Ukraine. Then B would be through southern Poland, and A is going to be through Poland and the Baltic states as Eisengruppen advances behind the German front lines, going to all these portions of the former Soviet Union and killing Jews and others too. Others too, as you guys know. It's not just the Jews, but Jews and others. And this would be the first step in the mass Holocaust that you and I know. The numbers are quite large. We talked about this one already. We talked about Ukraine a little bit, but one of the largest massacres by the Eisengruppen took place September 29 to 30, 1941, in which over 33,000 Jews were murdered over those 2 days outside of Kyiv. Now, there are probably, as far as total numbers, even bigger massacre around Odessa. As you guys know from listening to the news, Odessa is often in the news these days too. Odessa down on the coast of the Black Sea. But Odessa, I believe the total number of Jews killed there about 50,000. I think over a longer period of time. So probably over just the 2 days, this is probably the biggest 2-day mass killing of Jews during the first part of the Holocaust. But total numbers from one community probably would be from Odessa, which happened, I think, a bit after this. But as often is the case, what we cannot forget, we talk about the Holocaust too, many of those are dying too. Historians estimate probably at least another 100,000 are killed in those same ravines outside Kyiv that we know as the Babi Yar massacre. So you have Jews killed there, but you also have Ukrainians who are accused of being communists and so forth, plus Soviet prisoners of war who are also gunned down by the tens of thousands and buried there in those ravines right outside Kyiv. There's some photographs. This one shows actually Russian prisoners of war burying the bodies. You can't see them, but they would be beneath all this dirt here as they're being buried by these Russian prisoners of war. Down the left is a photograph, not very good quality, but it's showing a mass shooting of Soviet citizens. And that'd be at Babi Yar. Other infamous situations in that photograph I showed you a bit earlier of this man right here, the Beast, or what is his name again? Death Dealer. This man right here. That photograph of that same event is right here, where he beat to death that whole large group there of Jewish men. You can see the blood on the ground as he beat them to death with that large crowd watching in the background, including some German soldiers who are simply watching him do this. Again, that's not from nowhere. That community probably had been scarred by NKVD executions, and so they're probably very angry and on edge, looking for payback. But again, the Jews fall into that scapegoat. Foot is a larger issue that had probably nothing to do with them. And then other iconic, terrible photographs. That would be another ghetto that's being liquidated in Ukraine. That photograph on the right leaves a bunch of women who are being executed by German soldiers. Already many of them are shot and killed. These soldiers are walking through that group to make sure they are all dead. If you're curious about this topic, a few books I recommend to you guys would be Masters of Death by Richard Rhodes. That's in the SS Eisengruppen in the Holocaust. Ordinary Men by Christopher R. Browning is a study of like who does this, like how do you recruit for the Eisengruppen? Like again, just what kind of human being does that? What? Because you don't just do it for one day, right? That is your job. This is months and months of this. So who does this? How do you recruit for that? Could you say no? It's a fascinating, very chilling study of humanity and following orders and those who bravely did not and what happened to them by Christopher Browning. And then the book on the right, which I just found doing my research in Ukraine, called Babi Yar. And this actually printed in the Soviet Union back in the 1960s by a Ukrainian who although the book is fictional, he very carefully researched it. So I call this historic fiction. But it's based on the terrible Baba Yar massacre and what took place before and after, and obviously the events itself. It's considered a classic. Then that book on the right called The Ravine. This is talking about, again, these Eisengruppen killings. And this is a historian came across a very specific photograph. We don't have a lot of photographs of the Eisengruppen. And these, we have some, I showed you some, there's some more. But she came across maybe an unpublished photograph, but a quite graphic one, a very revealing one that shows a boy sitting on the edge when he's killing Fitz. He's not yet been shot, but you can see the killer is firing into the people around him. And she wanted to research that and know who was that, what was this. And if you want to get more of a close-in look at what there's like in one specific massacre, The Ravine might be a good choice for you, by Wendy Lower. And something else I mentioned earlier, again, when I mentioned the Eisengruppen, of course, it's not just Eisengruppen doing the killings. Oftentimes, you have many local units, local police, local national groups, local security forces. Could also have aspects of the German army with you. But that book by Jan Gross called Neighbors, which won the National Book Award, you see, finalist, is talking about this very thing, which oftentimes I think of the Holocaust, we think of the SS, the Death's Head caps, and the Eisengruppen, and as we should. That's appropriate. We shouldn't be thinking of that. But saying it's maybe in a chilling way, but it's broader to that. It's not just the SS units who are doing this, that sometimes neighbors who know each other for various reasons participate, either out of fear or perhaps out of hatred, perhaps out of jealousy, perhaps a desire for revenge, long-serving anti-Semitism, fear to fit in, etc. The title Neighbors is very chilling because neighbors obviously means people you know, but people who you know who report you or participate directly in the violence, etc. Now that is the first part of the Holocaust, which is, I suppose, it's organized on the one hand, but it's also a bit chaotic. It's not easy on these. It's not easy on these German units. The Eisengruppen doing all these killings. You can imagine psychologically how it'd be for the average person. It's a bit messy. There's a lot of witnesses to this stuff going down. And the Germans are going to shift into a new policy. Let me make this a little bigger for you guys because it's kind of small. That's better. And that is the next time I want you guys to know. And this is the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. This is a meeting on the outskirts of Berlin set up during a cold winter day when Germany is still appearing to be winning the war, although they're encountering some difficulties, but still appear to be on the winning side of the war. It's a meeting especially called by this man right here, Reinhard Heydrich right here, who's really the number 2 in the SS under, that's Reinhard Heydrich. That's Adolf Eichmann in the middle. I'm sorry. Reinhard Heydrich is sent there by Himmler, but ultimately at the behest, we believe, of Hitler, of course, the originator of all this, to plan a meeting in which the SS is going to seize absolute control of the Jewish problem, as they would say, and to coordinate the final solution. And no longer are they going to try to simply move the Jews into the Soviet gulag or some fanciful plan to send them to Madagascar. Of course, hopefully many die on the way there, and then many die in Madagascar, but at least they're out of Europe, so they're out of our hands. All those plans now have been abandoned as unworkable or too expensive or not possible, and they come up to the final solution that you and I probably tragically are quite familiar with, which is the mechanized death of the death camps. And so it's in that conference in January 1942 that this is announced to all the pertinent German governmental bodies or entities who need to all participate in this. Most of them, not surprisingly, are in Eastern Europe because that's where the vast majority of Jews are, as you guys know. The number of Jews in Germany was always quite small. I was just listening to Timothy Snyder this morning, and he was saying the number of Jews killed in the Holocaust, of the total number of Jews killed in the Holocaust, only 3% were German Jews. 3%. 97% are Jews that are non-German. And the vast majority of those, as you guys know, live in Eastern Europe, above all Poland, and then Soviet Ukraine. Obviously, other places in Europe, but that's number one, number two. So what are we going to do with this? And this conference is Reinhard Heydrich to announce to the various SS and all these department and governmental leaders of Eastern Europe and Poland and Ukraine and so forth that now we have transitioned from what we were doing before, and now we're going to systematically eliminate all the Jews, in this case through the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, Klemo, Belzec, etc. Now, the Germans were aware that this is a crime against humanity, although they would not see it that way, right? They'd see this as doing humanity a favor, and they'd be very proud of their work. But they're still aware that a lot of the world is not going to look at it that way, so they're careful in the notes of that meeting not to use honest words. So they don't use words like we're just going to kill them all or murder them all. They use words like evacuation. They use euphemisms to try to disguise what's really taking place there, even though everybody in that room knows precisely what's being talked about. But that is the turning point, that conference. Not that we're saying the decision hadn't already been reached. Probably the highest reach is whether Hitler had one day in the fall of 1941, where he sits down with Himmler and his others, and Goebbels and Göring and so forth, and Bormann, and sits down and make a final, like, quote, decision. We don't have any documentation from Hitler's hand himself saying, in December 41, Hitler decides we're going to gas them all those who are still alive under our control. But the fact that we don't have the document, there's no question, though, that SS have been empowered and that Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich have been empowered by Hitler himself to carry out this policy, but to give Hitler at least a slight deniability that perhaps there's no document from him saying he authorized this, but undoubtedly he did, because the SS has always worked hand in glove as an expression of the Nazi Party and Hitler's will specifically. If you guys are curious about this, I recommend some movies to you guys. Conspiracy, which came out in 2001. All British and American actors, but done extremely well. I highly recommend it to you guys. It's on the Want to See conference. Just those 2 hours, some of the most 2 hours of chilling meeting in world history, in which, in a very bureaucratic way, they decide to extinguish millions of people. And by the way, I mentioned this in previous lectures too. Although 6 million or 6+ million Jews died in the Holocaust, 67 million, as you guys know, but the Germans planned to eliminate all Jews in Europe. Now, there are areas in Europe they never got to, for example, England and other places they didn't get to. But when the Germans said all Jews from Europe, they mean all Jews. So that would be looking at perhaps 10, 11 million, and that'd be worldwide eventually too. So the German plan was not to be content with the 6, 7 million. They planned to extinguish all Jews when they conquer those territories where Jews remain. And they talked about it, and they planned it. So it's almost a Holocaust times 2, essentially, is their goal, among other things, which just takes the level of nightmare to a higher level. Adolf Eichmann was Reinhard Heydrich's number 2 at that meeting and in charge for a lot of coordination. He'll ultimately go on to be an extermination camp commander at Auschwitz. A German version of that movie, which just came out last year, is called The Conference, although that's the English name, obviously has a German name. I don't know if you can find that on Netflix. I think I found it on YouTube at the pay for it. I have not watched it yet, but I'm looking forward to doing that. It's in German, so you'll be reading subtitles, but also sounds like it's very good. I really enjoyed, obviously in a very sobering way, watching Conspiracy, because they did an excellent job. I'm looking forward to seeing the German language version of that, The Conference. At that conference, the Germans announced something that had already been taking place, which already been experimenting with gas chambers, mobile gas vans. This is a depiction of what mobile gas vans would look like. This photograph on the right shows Himmler at Auschwitz in 42. And by 42, they're just getting Auschwitz ready to become a death camp. It's not quite yet a death camp yet, still a detention camp, and a place you could likely die. But it has not been converted into the killing machine Auschwitz would become, but it's in the process of being converted. And of course, that means the final solution, the last part of the Holocaust, and that is a plan to put them on trains, take them out of the ghettos. They're being stored in ghettos in Eastern Europe, most famous the Warsaw Ghetto, and now we're simply to put them on trains so as fast as the camps can process in the darkest kind of way, a shipment of Jews. The next train will arrive with the next shipment to be processed. Of course, gypsies, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, mentally disabled, many others are also killed by the Germans. Political prisoners sometimes go in there too. So it's not just Jews. Anyone who the Nazis view as any kind of ideological, racial, or moral threat to them. Some ministers, priests, ministers are sent to there as well too. Anyone who speaks out what the Nazis are doing, if they decide not to execute you outright, which is quite common too, they just execute them outright. But if not, it's not unusual for them to be sent to a concentration camp. The vast majority of concentration camps are in Poland, not surprisingly, because that's where many Jews are, as you guys know. Now, there's exceptions. Auschwitz is in Germany, but most of the killing camps are going to be in Poland. You can see them: Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor, Belzec. There are other death camps too, but those they're in Poland, and again, there's a few others, and there's some other camps on a lower level, and then some camps that are quite famous are not actually technically a death camp, although the chances of surviving that camp is very low. For example, look at the map here. Freudenstadt, for example. Look at some of the other ones here too. Sachsenhausen, Ravensbrück, Bergen-Belsen. Yeah, those camps are not technically death camps, but the starvation level there, they are death camps with many enemies. But it does mean the camp is not set up explicitly by this point in the war to be an extermination center, even though the terrible conditions there, the brutality, the violence, the lack of food makes many of those other camps, for all practical purposes, a lower volume death camp. But they're not technically an explicitly extermination center with the gas chambers and the ovens processing in mass numbers Jews and killed them. Instead, or Dachau, for example. Dachau is probably the most famous, not technically a death camp, but again, the death rate there would be extremely high based on the abuse and violence taking place in Dachau. And I won't spend time here. I think when I get to the end of this lecture, you guys are pretty familiar. I don't want to overload you guys too much the Holocaust it is. Obviously, we could spend much more time on the horrific nightmare, what it would be like to be sent to these camps, and the Jewish guards there, some of the commandos who worked there, and the medical experiments and biological experiments, and just grisly stuff by Dr. Mengele, ghoulish stuff, and I'm not going to get into that. You're welcome to do some more research on that. I just put a few photographs in here. On the left, you see Jewish children being deported to Klemno there in Poland. You see how young they are. Just, it's hard to even imagine, but just being some of the kids that are barefoot as they're sent to be exterminated. Then on the right, Auschwitz, those are bodies being burned. On the left, that's a photograph from Bergen-Belsen, I believe, which is, again, technically not a death camp, but because of the horrific abuse there and starvation diet, of course, in reality, it's a death camp. They may not have the ovens and crematoria, but it's a death camp by the tens of thousands there. And this guy was one of the doctors in charge of it. He'd be executed for war crimes, being forced to move bodies in there by probably British forces here at the end of the war. And on the right, there's the Auschwitz. This is some of the crematoria used to process the bodies of those who have been gassed and to burn them. All right, let's get to sources of the Holocaust. And I did promise you a final brief story here, so I want to get to that shortly too. Maybe I'll do that now. So, back 5 years ago, something like that, about 5 years ago, maybe 2017, I think it was, maybe 18, doesn't matter. Anyways, my daughter in junior high took a trip with her class back to Washington, D.C. when she was in junior high. I had a chance to go with them. We visited all kinds of stuff. We went to Gettysburg, and we spent quite a few days in Washington, D.C. And one of the things on the tour was the Holocaust Museum, which I could not highly recommend enough there in Washington, D.C. Obviously, it's a very grim, powerful place. So don't go there if you're having a tough day, obviously. But as an adult, it's a must if you visit Washington D.C., along with many brighter places in Washington D.C. So I recommend going to the Holocaust Museum in the morning and then doing something which is a much better aspect of humanity in the afternoon. In any case, so I was having a chaperone, about 6 teenage girls, junior high students, who I keep an eye on them as they're going through the museum. Now, I know when you're in junior high, there's only so much of the horror nightmare of the Holocaust you can take, and so the girls were taking it in. But there's a lot to process there. They have a room there full of shoes taken from some of these concentration camps, and the shoes, baby shoes, even high heels, men's work shoes, just this room full of shoes. And when you're looking at that, you're thinking, when the last person who wore that shoe, when they took that shoe off, they died in a gas chamber probably half an hour later or 20 minutes later. And now that shoe is sitting there right in front of me. Baby shoes, women's shoes, kids' shoes. It's just, there's many things at museum. Now, the museum is also done very thoughtfully after you finish each floor, because again, it is so emotionally overwhelming and so impactful, just the sinister nature of what you're seeing in front of you. At the end of each floor, because you take an elevator to the top, you start at the top and you work your way down. So once you finish a floor, as you descend the stairs to the next floor, they have these kind of quiet spaces for you to catch your breath, which makes sense. For example, they have some big open bay windows. You can look outside. You can decompress a little bit, let go of some of the weight of sadness and shock at just the terrible plight and state of humanity and the terrible loss of life. So they have something. So when you're going down these stairs, you can kind of decompress a little bit. But anyways, so after we did, I think, the top floor, maybe the second floor, we had gone down in the stairway. The stairway was very simply decorated with white walls, and there's some windows there, and there's some benches, and there's a bathroom there. And so one of the girls wanted to use the teenage girls wanted to use the restroom, so the rest of us stopped, and so we were standing there. And there's a landing there on this kind of stair area, because the stair area is quite large. It's not small. So it's a very kind of large for the people to go down. There's people walking by, and there was an older lady sitting there on the bench. And at first, I didn't really notice her. And on the walls around us, and at the time I didn't really notice initially, but there were these large, what looked like paintings, because you would see a very, very large frame. By the way, way larger than this, by the way. These large, like, frames, but the painting itself was simply all white, no texture. So to me, when I was standing there waiting for one of the girls I was chaperoning to use the restroom, I thought maybe they're going to put paintings in there. Maybe these big frames are like placeholders for some artwork that will go there that has not been installed yet, but they may want to kind of see what it's going to look like, and so they put these big frames on the walls for the artwork to go there. That was my thought, just kind of standing there looking around on the stairs there on this large landing. Then I noticed there was a woman on the bench. And I don't remember now if she was talking to a person next to her. I don't think she was. But I noticed she was crying. And again, there's no one, like, I didn't think anybody was like talking to her per se. And she was looking at these, again, like these blank canvas framed paintings. But again, there's no painting there because you're simply a blank canvas. And she was crying and saying, nobody knows what these are. Nobody knows what they are. And I didn't know what she was meaning either. I was like I could see she's looking again like these large frame where a painting would be. There's a frame there, but there's no painting there. I didn't know what she was talking about initially. And I think maybe someone sat beside her, and then as she was talking loudly enough, I could hear her as she was crying and sobbing. And she says, the reason why those paintings are blank, that represents the lives that would not be, and the lives that are cut off. And so there is no art. There's nothing from that life beyond there. The life is extinguished. And so the canvas is showing the rest of the life that never happened. It's blank. And I was listening to that. I was like, wow, that's so powerful. I had no idea what that meant either. And I was just standing there, and eventually the girl came to the bathroom, and we went down and resumed our tour. But that just grabbed me so profound, because again, I standing there seeing that artwork, I didn't even notice it. I had no idea what it was. But seeing that lady, and she was an older lady, by the way. I don't know how old she was. I would guess 70s, maybe 80s. I don't know how old she was. I don't know if she was old enough to be a Holocaust survivor, perhaps. She's certainly old enough to be a direct descendant of a Holocaust survivor. But looking at their art there and being overwhelmed and seeing people going up and downstairs, like I was one of them, along with the girls I was chaperoning, and all the people walking by and not realizing what was in front of us and what that represented. And she was in tears and sobbing, talking about, this is what we're talking about, the lives that got cut short, and that was the end. And we'll never know what they could have been, the joy they could have brought to the world, the art, their life, their family, their loves, their passions, their everything, and all that just disappeared because their life is extinguished. And that would be in the millions. And I thought, what a profound way to look at the Holocaust, such a personal way. And so I wanted to share that story with you guys. And as we wrap it up, because I know I need to wrap this up, I have some recommendation for you guys. One, I guess, good thing, something so incredibly, profoundly sad, and the worst humanity is there's been an extraordinary amount of scholarship done on the Holocaust, as you guys know. There are countless books. I'm going to recommend just a couple of these, but this, by no means, this is just introduction, frankly. So I already mentioned that book, Ostkrieg, by Stefan Fritz. That's talking about the larger war in the East, but obviously the Holocaust being a part of that. And that book right next to it, Holocaust by Lawrence Rees, just came out a couple years ago. It's a very nice and very new synthesis of a scholarship, and a very well done, a lot of first-hand accounts of both the victims but also the perpetrators of the Holocaust. It's been highly recommended, and that came out just a few years ago. And The Years of Extermination won the Pulitzer Prize a bit farther back by Saul Friedlander, is a classic, won the Pulitzer Prize, you guys see, on the Holocaust. Black Earth by Timothy Snyder. You guys know Timothy Snyder from quite a bit from our Ukrainian conversations. He has a specific take on the Holocaust, which would be fascinating to you guys. Same thing for his Bloodlands, similar. The Final Solution by David Cicierani is also a classic, would be very good. Elie Wiesel, I should say, his Night, you guys may have read that in high school, and of course, that's barely scratching the surface. There are hundreds and hundreds of exceptionally good books that you guys can find on Amazon. A good place to go would be the Holocaust Museum of Washington, D.C., go to their store and look at their books. So they have an extensive collection of books that they're going to recommend on the Holocaust. That would be a good place. Of course, you guys can Google it too, but seeing what that bookstore has in the store might be a good way to find stuff maybe you wouldn't find as easily on your own. And we should stop right here. So we talked about this because we can do better as humanity, you and I, in our small part, to keep a historic memory alive. To be aware of the danger sides, do our part in our democracy and in our world, despite our voice being small, to do our best to let the world not forget and look for warning signs that we see around the world today and be quick to move to defend the best instead of participating in the worst. So with that, I'm going to let you guys go. So I hope you guys are all well. Keep digging. There's many wonderful movies on the Holocaust you guys know too. But that's for another day, so we should go. So take care, everybody.